1935 came and the Nuremberg laws were passed, which I hope, because you're studying for your GCSEs, you've heard of. Uh, One of the provisions in the Nuremberg law was that no non-Jewish woman under the age of 45 could work and live in a Jewish household, because the Nazis were, and Hitler was paranoid about racial purity. And there was a theoretical fear that something could happen. We had a young woman who was our nanny and had been with us since my sister Ruth was born in 1929. And when the Nuremberg laws were passed, out she went and she left, which was a bit of a surprise what happened to her. But nevertheless, we went on. Now, I have a feeling that there were really Nazis everywhere, and they were constantly in the streets. My mother tells a story of being in the downtown of our city on a shopping trip. A group of Nazis came parading down the street. Everybody stopped, which was required and was known to the populace. And you have to stop and you have to raise your hand and you have to say Heil Hitler. My mother forced herself to do this with great difficulty. You also had to salute when Hitler came on in the cinema, which he did before the main film. And then the rules came that Jews were no longer allowed to go to the cinema. They weren't going to go anyway. My sister was upset because there was a young child star who had a series of films that she went to. Remember, we had no television. The cinema was a big entertainment. Also, we were no longer allowed to use parks. We were no longer allowed to use the public ice skating ring or the roller skating ring and all kinds of facilities, things that we used to do. My father played ninth in bowling. No Jews allowed there anymore either. Everything became constricted. And the business people told my father they were afraid to be seen in a Jewish store. And some of them just didn't come anymore. So life was getting really, really difficult. And we come now to 1938, and let me tell you, 1936. My younger sister Leah was born. Now she was born at home, and the reason she was born at home is that Jewish women were no longer permitted in our city to go and give birth in a hospital. Fortunately, in our case, there were no problems, and she was fine. Now, we went on holiday to Czechoslovakia in the German part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Some of you may know there was a section which was really pro-German and pretty much taken up. But in order to get away and get a rest of all of this, we went there and we're sitting in this public place on a bench, kind of enjoying the sunshine, when a man in a Nazi uniform comes along, stops in front of us, my mother, my sisters, and me, and he picks me up. And he starts swinging me back and forth. And he looks at my mother, and he said, "What a beautiful Aryan child." I'm not going to tell you what Aryan is. You're supposed to know that already. Am I right? Yeah. After a while, he put me down and said to my mother, "Madam, you ought to be congratulated for producing such a beautiful Aryan child." I was very fair, with my reddish blonde hair, blue eyes. I was typical of what a Jew might look like theoretically. And of course, going back to 1933 in the story I told you, you can't really identify a Jew as such necessarily. It's just one of these other things. We're still waiting for our visa, and the Jewish agency which handles our visa informs us on more than one occasion that yes, we've come to the top of the list, but they gave our visa to someone else who was in imminent danger. Someone who word was received, was on the verge of being arrested, incarcerated, and so needed to get out immediately. And so it's 1938, and we're still here, and we're still waiting. At the end of October 1938, happened to be my sister's birthday, Ruth's birthday. She was going to be 9. My mother was upstairs in our flat baking a cake. When a call came through from my father from the shop, you have to come downstairs immediately. She protests, I'm baking, you must have come down, you must come down. She stops everything, makes sure that Leah is sleeping, the little one, in her crib. My sister and I are in school. And she comes down, and there were 2 Nazi officials, and they have come for my grandfather, who I told you was living with us. And said they're going to wait until he comes back. An event, he was visiting one of his other children, my Aunt Sadie, who also lived, he would do this, he'd visit different family members for lunch, and then he'd come back. And eventually he came home, and my father tells his father that he's got to go with the officers, because there was nothing you could do. There was no way to protest, you couldn't run any place. He was 79 years old in any event. Takes a roll that he has in his pocket that he'd stopped to buy and hands it to my mother and says, keep it for me. And the Nazi says, no, 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 it might take a little bit longer, you can keep it. And off he went with the policeman, and my parents sit in the shop. My mother goes upstairs, and they wait for him to come home, and he doesn't come home. Finally, my father says maybe he's gone to his brother's house, because my Uncle Morris, his brother, lives near the main police station, and maybe grandfather went there because it was getting late. And so he goes to Uncle Morris's house, and there were a lot of Jewish people standing there, and they're all upset and talking about mass arrests of Jews, men, women, and children. And the common denominator of those who were arrested was that they were people who were Polish and did not have German citizenship. My father went home extremely distressed. The next morning he goes to the downtown police station with a blanket, my grandfather's prayer books, and some warm clothing. It's already the end of October. And he's told, no, 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 the Jews are gone. We've sent them back on the train. We've all sent them to Poland. We are getting rid of the Jews of Germany. We are making Germany free of Jews. This was, in fact, the first mass deportation of Jews from Germany, October 1939, October 29th, October 30th. Soon Kristallnacht came. I won't go into the theoretical of why it happened, but on the night of November 9th, which is my sister Leah's birthday, as it happened, dreadful things seem to happen at my sister's birthdays. In the middle of the night, there's a pounding on our door. My father sees what is happening. He opens the door. 5 Nazis in uniform and the local police chief push into our flat and say to my father, get dressed, you are under arrest, you have to come with us. 2 men watched while my father got dressed. My sister Ruth and I are standing at our bedroom door, seeing all this commotion. The other Nazis basically trashing our flat, emptying cupboards, turning over furniture, breaking dishes, whatever. The local police chief comes by our room, sees my mother, pushes us back into our room and says, the girls don't need to see this. And soon my father is dressed and leaves along with the Nazi officers, and the local police chief, interestingly, turns to my mother because he's known the family for all the years that we've lived there, and says, get yourself and the girls out of Germany. My mother sits the whole night not knowing what to do, what has happened. She wanders around the flat, comes to my grandfather's room. Our grandfather was a very observant Jew, had many important holy books. The Nazis had taken all of his books, torn the papers out of the beautiful leather spines. Some other artifacts that he had were trampled on the ground. it was a desecration of Jewish religious items. Mother sits the whole night. In the morning, the doorbell rings. The shop assistant comes and says, you have to come down. She goes downstairs and finds that the sidewalk is littered with glass. The shop windows have been broken. The counters in the store have been smashed. This is the reason where the expression Kristallnacht, or the night of broken glass, comes. Because all over Germany, the same thing happened. My mother was made to clean up the glass, and try to get some order in the store. She came back upstairs, and very soon our doorbell starts to ring, and it is various relatives and friends all coming to say that their men have been arrested. And one of the women says that our synagogue, which my grandfather had founded when he came from Poland 30 years earlier, the synagogue was burned to the ground. The women, everyone wants to know what is happening. My mother says, I will go to the local, across the street to the police station, find out what happened. She goes there and is told, if you want your husband to come out of the concentration camp of Buchenwald, where all the men now are, get him a visa so that he can leave Germany. Germany is to be clean of Jews. My mother manages, with a great deal of effort, after several weeks, to find a forged visa. It is no longer possible to find a visa from any country that will take Jews. Whatever visas there were have been used up. She presents the visa at the police station, and my father comes home, shaken, quiet, doesn't say very much. There was no forced labor at Buchenwald at that time. Other than that, they had little food, they slept on the ground, and they watched while Jews who tried to escape from the camp were hanged in front of everybody. My father packs up and leaves for France because my mother got a visa for Paris. Her sister had been living there with her husband for some years. And so now grandfather has disappeared, father has disappeared, came back, he's gone again, and we are evicted from our flat. There is a rule that came about at this time in Germany, all over Germany, and Austria as well, as a matter of fact, that Jews were no longer permitted to have nice big proper flats like ours. We had a large flat, a room for me, grandfather, dining room. My father had been doing very well. There was a list of flats owned by Jews where you could go, and if your flat wasn't on that list, then you had to vacate your flat. And so, since we were not on the list, that was the end of our home for us in our city of Halle. My mother's father lived in the city of Leipzig, and his flat was one of the designated flats. So at that point, my mother sent my sisters and me to stay with the other grandfather while she tried to get a visa for herself. I want to say something briefly about school. Whether Jewish children could attend school was a matter for the various provinces and cities, towns and localities. In our town, there was no blanket order, no Jewish children in schools. I have a friend who lives in Stanmore now, who comes from my city, and she left her school because she was bullied for being a Jew, called names by the students and the teachers, hit, and her parents took her out of the school. It was different for us, somehow. Our teacher actually came to my mother and said, send the girls back to school. And my mother did send us back to school for a day or two after Kristallnacht, while we were waiting for father. But it got too difficult, and she was too nervous, and so we no longer went to school. We were in Leipzig living with my grandfather, 22 people, in a 5-room flat, 1 kitchen, 1 bathroom. You managed one way or the other. My older sister went to school run by Jewish people. I didn't go to school anymore. I was too young to go. although I was of school age. For that, I was too young.